My name is Liam Ann, and I grew up in a home where warmth and laughter felt like distant dreams. The walls held more silence than comfort, and every day felt like walking on fragile glass, fearing it might shatter beneath me. While others found solace in their families, I learned to find strength in solitude, carrying the weight of longing for a love that never truly embraced me. My mother, Mrs. Teresa, was a gentle, patient woman who endured everything in silence. She was the kind of person who believed that suffering in silence was a virtue, that as long as she could hold on, things would eventually get better. But they never did. My father, Mr. Henry, was the opposite of her. He was an alcoholic, a man with a violent temper, and someone who never seemed to know the meaning of love or kindness. Our house was incredibly small, just one cramped room with a tiny porch at the front. It was the kind of place where every sound echoed, where every argument, every broken bottle, and every cry of pain felt like it seeped into the walls. My childhood was filled with the constant terror of my father's drunken rage. I grew up with the sound of his shouting, the sight of my mother's bruises, and the overwhelming helplessness that came with knowing I couldn't stop any of it. At night, the fear didn't go away. It followed me into my sleep, creeping into my dreams and turning them into nightmares. My mother always tried to shield me from the worst of it. But how could she protect me when she couldn't even protect herself? As a child, I found comfort in sleeping beside my mother. Her presence was the only thing that made me feel safe in a house where safety didn't exist. But as I got older, she started forcing me to sleep separately. She never gave me a reason, only a firm, almost desperate warning. Liam Ann, you must sleep on your own. Stay away from your father. I didn't understand. I was still young, still afraid of the dark, still frightened by the wind that howled through the cracks in our broken windows, still startled by the strange noises that filled the house at night. Sleeping alone felt unbearable, so I ignored my mother's warnings. Many nights I would sneak back into her bed, pressing my face against her back, seeking the warmth and security that only she could provide. But one night, I made a mistake that I would never be able to erase. It was an unbearably hot evening. The air inside our tiny home was stifling, thick with the scent of alcohol and unspoken tension. The electricity had gone out, plunging the house into complete darkness. I woke up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, feeling suffocated by the heat and the heavy silence that surrounded me. I instinctively reached out, searching for the one source of comfort I knew, my mother. I climbed out of my thin mattress on the floor and made my way towards her bed. It was pitch black, and I couldn't see anything, but I moved by memory, by habit. As I lay down, I pressed my face against the familiar warmth beside me, seeking solace in its presence. But then, I smelled it. The overpowering stench of alcohol, the thick, nauseating scent that I had come to associate with fear, with danger. My entire body froze. My heart pounded violently in my chest as realization crashed over me like a tidal wave. This wasn't my mother. I had climbed into the wrong bed. The person lying beside me, the one whose breathing was heavy and uneven, was my father. A wave of sheer terror surged through me. My limbs locked up, my breath hitched in my throat. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to move, but I was paralyzed by fear. For one horrible moment, I thought he had noticed me, that he would wake up, and I couldn't let that happen. Summoning every ounce of strength I had, I bolted upright, stumbling back as quietly as I could. My body was shaking so violently that I thought I might collapse. My breath was ragged, my mind racing with every awful possibility of what could have happened if I hadn't realized in time. I scrambled back to my little corner of the room, pressing myself against the wall as if that could somehow protect me. I curled up, hugging my knees to my chest, trying to slow my breathing, trying to stop the tears that burned at the edges of my vision. If I hadn't realized sooner, what would have happened? I didn't dare think about it. The next morning, my mother immediately noticed something was wrong. She was always perceptive when it came to me. Even when she was exhausted from another sleepless night, even when she was nursing bruises that she never spoke about. She reached out to me gently, concern etched into her tired face. "Liam Ann, what's wrong? Did something happen?" I wanted to tell her. I wanted to confess everything, to tell her about the mistake I had made, about how terrified I had been. But the words wouldn't come. A lump formed in my throat, heavy and suffocating. So I shook my head. I forced myself to pick up my spoon and eat my breakfast as if nothing had happened. Because I knew. I knew that if I told her, she would blame herself. She would be devastated. And I couldn't do that to her. But from that day on, something inside me changed. I started watching my father more closely. I began noticing things I hadn't fully understood before, how his eyes darkened when he was drunk, how his gaze lingered on me in a way that made my skin crawl. I finally understood why my mother had been so insistent. She had been trying to protect me, and I had been too naive to see it. I felt a deep, aching sorrow for my mother, a pain so heavy it made my chest tighten. I pitied her, pitied both of us, trapped in this endless cycle of fear and suffering. Then, one night, everything changed. I was asleep when a sharp, gut-wrenching scream tore through the silence. My mother's scream. My eyes snapped open. My heart pounded violently as I scrambled up, barely able to process what was happening. Then I saw it. My father had my mother by the hair, dragging her to the corner of the room. She thrashed against him, her arms flailing, her voice breaking with terror. "Henry, let me go. Don't do this in front of our child." But he didn't listen. He never listened. His grip only tightened as he yanked her down, his drunken breath filling the air. My mother gasped in pain, her nails digging into his arm, trying to free herself. But she was too small, too weak. And I was frozen. Fear gripped me like an iron vice, rooting me to the floor. My body trembled violently. My mind screamed at me to do something, but I couldn't move. Then I saw my mother's face. Her eyes filled with terror, silently pleading for help. Something inside me snapped. I lunged forward, throwing myself at my father's leg. My tiny hands clung onto him as I screamed with everything I had. "Stop! Stop hitting, Mom! Please stop!" He turned sharply, his furious gaze landing on me. His eyes, wild, red with alcohol and rage, held nothing but madness. For a moment, I saw something else in them, something dark and twisted. Then his hand shot up. I barely had time to react before it came crashing down toward me. I squeezed my eyes shut. A sharp breath caught in my throat. I braced myself for the pain, for the stinging slap that I knew would come. But it never did. Silence. I hesitantly opened my eyes, and what I saw made my breath hitch. My mother stood in front of me, her arms spread wide, shielding me. Her entire body trembled, but her eyes burned with a fire I had never seen before. "If you lay a single hand on my child, I swear to God, Henry, I will never forgive you." For the first time in my life, I saw my father hesitate. His raised hand wavered in the air, his expression caught between fury and something else, something close to fear. Then, with a frustrated growl, he shoved my mother away. She collapsed onto the floor, gasping for breath. My father cursed under his breath, stumbling backward before storming out of the house, slamming the door so hard that the walls trembled. And then, there was only silence. I rushed to my mother's side, my hands shaking as I held on to her. Tears streamed down my face, my whole body still trembling from the terror of what had almost happened. She pulled me into her arms, holding me so tightly it almost hurt. But I didn't care, because for the first time I had seen it. The moment my mother finally stood up to him. But the nightmare was far from over. After that night, my father changed. He no longer screamed, no longer beat my mother in front of me. But his silence was far more terrifying than any of his rage. Every time I entered the room, I could feel his eyes on me. It was not the gaze of a father. It was cold, dark, and haunting, as if I was no longer his daughter. I began avoiding him, keeping my distance as much as possible. Every night, I locked my door, checking it over and over before lying down. But deep down, I knew that flimsy door wouldn't keep me safe forever. And then, the night of terror arrived. The sky was pitch black, rain pounding against the roof like eerie whispers. My mother had rushed out to buy medicine because I had a slight fever. I lay curled under my blanket, trying to drown out the relentless downpour. Then the door creaked open. A chill shot down my spine. I turned and saw my father standing there, Under the dim light from the storm outside, his face looked pale, distorted by an unsettling smile. His eyes, clouded and unfocused, held something dark, something that made my stomach twist in fear. "Liam, what are you afraid of?" His voice was soft, eerily gentle. I gripped the blanket tighter, my heart hammering against my ribs. My whole body froze, cold sweat forming on my skin. He took a step inside, the door closing behind him. His hand trembled slightly, yet he reached for me. "Come here, my sweet girl." A violent shiver ran down my spine. I pressed myself against the corner of the room, my breath quick and uneven, my tears threatening to spill. Number, I couldn't let this happen. I couldn't. In a desperate moment, I screamed and shoved him away with all my strength. He stumbled back, startled, but his expression darkened in an instant. The door slammed open. My mother had returned. She stood there, breathless, eyes darting from me to him. And in that split second, she understood everything. Without hesitation, she lunged forward, grabbing the knife from the table. The cold blade pressed against my father's throat. "Henry, if you ever lay a hand on my daughter, I swear I will kill you." This time, her voice did not tremble. She was no longer weak. All that remained was pure, seething hatred. That night, my mother grabbed my hand and yanked me out of the house, the rain hammering down on us like shards of ice. We didn't stop running. We couldn't. My heart pounded so violently I thought it would burst. But we kept going, splashing through puddles, slipping on the slick pavement, running as if our lives depended on it. Because they did. We didn't stop until my lungs burned, until the world around us was nothing but darkness and the sound of rain drowning out my own ragged breaths. We had escaped, or so we thought. Life after leaving my father was hard, but at least it was ours. We found a cramped little apartment in the outskirts of the city, a place where no one knew us, where no one whispered about the bruises my mother tried to hide beneath long sleeves. She found work at a garment factory, sewing from dawn till night. I went to school, studied as hard as I could, and in the evenings, I helped her sell goods at the market. We barely scraped by. Some nights, we had to choose between paying rent or eating dinner. But for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid to close my eyes at night. There were no drunken footsteps creeping toward my door. No violent outbursts shattering the silence. For the first time, we were free. And then he found us. It was a late evening. The sky had turned deep indigo, the streets outside eerily quiet. My mother hadn't come home yet, and I was alone, tidying up our tiny room. Then a knock. Soft at first. I froze. Another knock? Louder. A slow, uneasy dread slithered through me. No one ever visited us. The knocking became pounding. Bang, bang, bang. My heart stuttered. Trembling, I crept toward the door, pressing my ear against the wood. I hesitated before cracking it open. Just a sliver. And that was when I saw him. My father, gaunt, hollow-eyed, wild. His face was leaner, his skin stretched tight over his sharp cheekbones, but I would recognize that drunken rage anywhere. His lips curled into a twisted sneer, his eyes bloodshot and burning with something even more terrifying than before. "You thought you could run from me forever, you little brat," he growled. A scream clawed up my throat, but before I could react, he shoved the door open. I stumbled back. "Run! Run!" my mind screamed, but my legs wouldn't move fast enough. Then, a hand in my hair. A violent yank. A sharp burning pain at my scalp. I choked on a sob, struggling, thrashing, clawing at his grip. I had escaped him once. I couldn't let him take me back. But he was stronger. "You and your mother think you can be happy without me?" He snarled, his breath thick with alcohol, his fingers tightening around my hair. "You belong to me," I gasped, kicking, twisting, anything to break free. "Let me go," I screamed. But he just laughed. A horrible, slurred laugh that made my stomach churn. Then he yanked me closer, his grip bruising. His voice dropped to a whisper, sickly, sweet, and venomous. "I'll show you what real pain is." I fought with everything I had, but I was powerless against the man who had been my worst nightmare since childhood. "Let me go," I screamed, my voice raw with terror. But no one heard me. Our tiny rented room sat at the very end of a dark, narrow alley, isolated, cut off from the world. no one was coming. Panic clawed at my throat as my father's grip tightened. His breath, thick with alcohol, reeked of violence. His eyes burned with something twisted, something monstrous. I was trapped. And then bang! The door exploded open. A massive figure barreled inside. Mr. Howard, our landlord, the man who had always watched over my mother and me. Without a moment's hesitation, he lunged at my father, grabbing him by the collar and throwing a bone-crushing punch straight to his face. Crack! My father reeled back, crashing onto the floor. Blood trickled from his mouth as he let out a guttural growl. "You sick bastard!" Mr. Howard bellowed, his voice shaking with rage. "How dare you touch her?" For the first time, my father hesitated. But then, his madness returned. His lips twisted into a sneer. He wasn't done. He shoved Mr. Howard aside and charged at me again, and that was when my mother arrived. She stood in the doorway, soaked from the rain, her breath ragged. The second her eyes landed on me, her expression shattered. Then something inside her ignited. With a scream, she lunged forward, her hands grabbing at me, yanking me away from him. "Henry!" she roared, her voice no longer trembling. It was blazing with fury. "You are no longer my husband, and you have no right over my daughter." She threw herself between us, her arms outstretched, shielding me. "Leave," she spat. "Or I swear to God I will end you." My father staggered back. His nostrils flared, his fists clenched, but for the first time in my life, I saw fear in his eyes. He had lost. Neighbors, drawn by the chaos, had gathered outside. Faces peered through the open door, angry, watching, ready to act. Someone had already called the police. Minutes later, red and blue lights flooded the alley. Officers stormed in, their voices sharp, their hands gripping my father and shoving him to the ground. He thrashed and cursed, but it didn't matter. It was over. As they dragged him away, his hateful eyes locked onto mine one last time. But this time, I wasn't afraid. For the first time in my life, I knew he was never coming back. The past did not let go easily, but neither did we. After that night, Mr. Howard, our landlord, the man who had shown us kindness when we had nowhere else to turn, helped my mother and me contact a support center for abused women. Through them, we found shelter, protection, and the first fragile taste of something we had long been denied. Safety. Life wasn't easy. My mother worked tirelessly at a sewing factory, her hands roughened from hours of labor. I juggled school and part-time jobs, trying to help in whatever way I could. We were still poor, still struggling. But for the first time in my life, I could sleep without fear of waking up to screams. For the first time, my mother could breathe without the weight of terror crushing her chest. We were free, and that was enough. But he wasn't done suffering. My father, or what was left of him, was sentenced for domestic violence. It didn't take long for the world to forget about him. The drinking buddies who once cheered him on now ignored his existence. The relatives who once made excuses for him now pretended he never existed. He was alone. In prison, he tried to reclaim control, to find someone weaker to hurt, just like he had done to us. But behind those iron bars, he was nothing. There was always someone stronger, someone meaner. He became the prey. And when he was finally released, he was a shell of the man I once feared, no longer a monster, just a sick, broken old man, rotting in his own misery. With no home to return to, no one left to take him in, he wandered the streets, hollow, starving, forgotten. And then, one winter night, bitter, cruel, and colder than any night before, he collapsed in a filthy alleyway, curled up like a dying animal. No one stopped. No one cared. By morning, he was just another nameless body, stiff with frost, swallowed by the darkness he had once inflicted on others. And me? When I heard the news, I felt nothing. No grief, no relief. Just an emptiness where my hatred used to be. I had spent my childhood drowning in fear, my teenage years burning with anger. But now, standing at the edge of his forgotten grave, I realized something. I wasn't afraid anymore. I wasn't even angry. He had destroyed himself, and I had already let him go. My mother stood beside me, silent. She didn't cry, didn't speak. She simply lit an incense stick, watching the thin trail of smoke rise and disappear into the wind. Once she had loved that man. Once she had given him everything, and he had left her with nothing but scars don't define us. We survived. And as we walked away, we did not look back. The past no longer owned us. The future was ours.